What I'm about to tell you is a story that happened right here in our neighborhood, and it's so unbelievable that when people first heard it, they thought it was made up. But this actually happened to 82-year-old Margaret Thompson, a sweet great-grandmother, who had been married for 60 years to the man she thought was the love of her life. When she discovered that her husband had been living a double life with their next-door neighbor for over 3 decades, what she did in response didn't just shock the entire community. It became an absolute legend that people are still talking about today, and I guarantee you'll be thinking about this story long after this video ends. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now because we bring you the most unbelievable true stories that you won't find anywhere else. Give this video a thumbs up if you love stories about people getting the justice they deserve. And make sure to comment below, telling me what you would have done in Margaret's situation. Margaret Thompson had always been the kind of woman everyone in the neighborhood looked up to. She baked cookies for new families moving in, organized charity drives for the local school, and had raised 4 children who all became successful adults. Her husband Robert was a retired postal worker who seemed like the perfect gentleman, always helping neighbors with their yard work, never missing church on Sunday, and treating Margaret with what appeared to be genuine love and respect. They lived in a charming 2-story house on Maple Street, the same house they'd bought as newlyweds in 1963. Right next door lived Susan Williams, a divorced woman in her late 50s who had moved in about 15 years ago. Susan was friendly enough, always waving hello and sometimes borrowing a cup of sugar, or asking Robert to help fix something around her house. Margaret never thought anything of it. After all, they were just being good neighbors. But Margaret started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Robert would often volunteer to help Susan with various projects that seemed to take much longer than they should. He'd come home from these helping sessions, looking flustered, immediately head straight to the shower. When Margaret asked about it, he'd always have a reasonable explanation. The work was messier than expected, or Susan had offered him a beer and he'd spilled it on himself. Then there were the phone calls. Margaret would answer the house phone and hear a woman's voice asking for Robert. But when Margaret asked who was calling, the person would quickly hang up. When she mentioned this to Robert, he claimed it was probably telemarketers or someone with the wrong number. Margaret wanted to believe him. After 60 years of marriage, trust was something she thought was unshakable. The real wake-up call came on a Tuesday morning in March. Margaret had been fighting a terrible flu for over a week, and was finally feeling well enough to venture outside for some fresh air. She decided to sit on her front porch with a cup of tea and enjoy the spring sunshine. That's when she saw something that made her blood run cold. Robert was coming out of Susan's back door, but he wasn't dressed in his usual work clothes. He was wearing a bathrobe that Margaret had never seen before. He was moving quietly, almost sneakily, looking around to make sure no one was watching. Margaret ducked behind her porch pillar and watched as her husband of 60 years kissed Susan goodbye, not a friendly peck on the cheek, but a long, intimate kiss between lovers. Margaret's world came crashing down in that moment. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her teacup, and it shattered on the porch floor. 60 years of marriage, 60 years of trust, 60 years of believing she knew the man she had shared her life with. All of it felt like a lie. But instead of confronting Robert immediately, Margaret decided she needed to know the full truth. Over the next few weeks, Margaret became a detective in her own life. She started paying attention to Robert's patterns, noting when he would disappear and for how long. She discovered that every Tuesday and Thursday, when he claimed to be going to the hardware store or running errands, he was actually spending hours at Susan's house. The pattern had been going on for years, but Margaret had been too trusting to notice. One afternoon, while Robert was supposedly at his weekly poker game, Margaret decided to do some investigating. She knew Susan worked late on Wednesdays, so the house would be empty. Margaret had kept a spare key to Susan's house from years ago when she used to water the plants during Susan's vacations. With her heart pounding, she let herself in. What she found in Susan's house devastated her beyond anything she could have imagined. The living room was filled with family photos, but they weren't photos of Susan's family. They were photos of Robert and Susan together, spanning what looked like decades. beach vacations, Christmas celebrations, anniversary dinners. An entire parallel life that Margaret knew nothing about. But the most shocking discovery was in the upstairs bedroom. On the dresser was a framed family portrait that made Margaret's knees buckle. It showed Robert and Susan with two young adults, a man and a woman who looked to be in their 20s. At the bottom of the frame was an inscription: "Our beautiful family, love always. Dad, Mom, David and Sarah." Margaret stared at that photo for what felt like hours. Robert had children with Susan. Not just an affair, not just a relationship. He had built an entire second family right next door to his real family. The young adults in the photo had Robert's eyes and Susan's smile. These weren't teenagers. They were grown adults, which meant this relationship had been going on for at least 25 years, possibly longer. Margaret found more evidence throughout the house. Birthday cards signed love, Dad in Robert's handwriting. School graduation photos, with Robert proudly standing next to young people Margaret had never seen before. A wedding album from what appeared to be the marriage ceremony of one of Robert's secret children, with Robert walking the bride down the aisle. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that Margaret actually felt physically sick. She rushed to Susan's bathroom and threw up, her body rejecting the reality of what she had discovered. This wasn't just infidelity, this was an entirely fabricated life. Robert had been living as two different people for decades. When Margaret finally composed herself enough to leave Susan's house, her mind was racing. She thought about confronting Robert immediately, but something inside her said to wait. She needed to process this information and decide how to handle it. After 60 years of being the dutiful, quiet wife, Margaret realized she had never really stood up for herself. This was going to change. That evening, Robert came home from his poker game, acting completely normal. He kissed Margaret on the forehead, asked about her day, and settled into his recliner to watch the evening news. Margaret watched him and marveled at how easily he could compartmentalize his life. How could someone live such an elaborate lie for so many years without any apparent guilt or remorse? Margaret spent the next several days acting completely normal, while internally planning her next move. She researched lawyers, looked into her financial situation, and most importantly, she started documenting everything. She took photos of the evidence in Susan's house, wrote down Robert's patterns and inconsistencies, and began building a case. But Margaret also realized something else during those planning days. She was angry. Not just hurt or sad, but genuinely furious in a way she had never experienced before. Robert hadn't just cheated on her. He had stolen decades of her life. He had made her an unwitting participant in his deception. Forced her to smile and wave at Susan for years while knowing the truth. He had made her look like a fool to the entire neighborhood. The more Margaret thought about it, the more she realized that a quiet divorce wasn't going to be enough. Robert deserved consequences that matched the magnitude of his deception. He had played a long game of lies and manipulation, and Margaret decided it was time for her to play a game of her own. Margaret's plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. She knew that Robert's greatest fear was public humiliation. He had always been obsessed with his reputation in the community. She also knew that his relationship with Susan was built on secrecy and the thrill of getting away with something. Margaret decided to destroy both of those things in one fell swoop. First, Margaret quietly consulted with a lawyer and filed for divorce. But she didn't serve Robert the papers immediately. Instead, she planned a special surprise for Robert's 85th birthday, which was coming up in 2 weeks. Margaret told Robert she wanted to throw him a big birthday party to celebrate their long marriage and his milestone birthday. Robert was delighted and agreed to let Margaret plan everything. Margaret sent invitations to everyone they knew, all 4 of their children and their families, Robert's siblings and cousins, longtime friends, neighbors, and members of their church congregation. She rented the community center and planned an elaborate celebration. But Margaret also sent special invitations to some people Robert wasn't expecting. She invited Susan and her 2 adult children, the ones from the family photo. In the invitation to Susan's family, Margaret wrote a personal note. "I think it's time we all met properly. Robert has told me so much about you over the years." Susan, panicked by the invitation, immediately called Robert. But Margaret had anticipated this and had been monitoring Robert's phone calls. When Susan called in a panic, Robert assured her that there was no way Margaret knew anything, and that Susan should just decline the invitation. But Margaret had one more surprise up her sleeve. She hired a private investigator to get more detailed information about Robert and Susan's relationship, including documentation of their secret children's births, school records, and other legal documents. What the investigator found was even more shocking than Margaret had imagined. Robert had been financially supporting Susan and their children for decades. He had taken out secret credit cards, emptied savings accounts that Margaret didn't know about, and had even remortgaged their house without Margaret's knowledge to pay for his secret family's expenses. Margaret discovered that their comfortable retirement savings had been secretly depleted to pay for Susan's children's college educations, cars, and even the down payment on Susan's house. Armed with all this information, Margaret finalized her plan. The birthday party would be Robert's public downfall, but it would also be Margaret's declaration of independence. After 60 years of being deceived, she was going to take control of her own narrative. The day of the party arrived, and Margaret was a picture of calm composure. She had spent the morning at the beauty salon getting her hair done and had chosen her favorite dress, an elegant navy blue outfit that made her feel confident and strong. Robert was in a great mood, excited about seeing all their friends and family. He had no idea what was coming. The community center filled up quickly. All 4 of their children were there, with their spouses and kids, creating a warm family atmosphere. Robert's old work buddies from the postal service showed up, along with their church friends and neighbors. Robert was in his element, shaking hands and accepting birthday wishes from everyone. Margaret played the part of the devoted wife perfectly, making sure everyone had food and drinks. About an hour into the party, when everyone was relaxed and enjoying themselves, Margaret noticed Susan and her 2 adult children hovering near the entrance. They looked nervous and uncertain, clearly unsure whether they should actually come in. Margaret walked over to them with a warm smile and introduced herself. "You must be Susan," Margaret said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "And these must be David and Sarah. I'm so glad you could finally make it to one of our family gatherings. Robert talks about you all the time." The 3 of them looked terrified, but Margaret's friendly demeanor and the crowd of people made it impossible for them to leave without causing a scene. Margaret guided Susan's family into the main party area, making introductions as they went. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet our neighbors, Susan, David, and Sarah. They're very special friends of Robert's." Robert, who had been across the room, talking to his brother, looked over and went completely white when he saw Susan and her children standing with Margaret. Margaret then did something that no one expected. She asked for everyone's attention and announced that she had a special surprise for Robert's birthday. The room quieted down as Margaret took the microphone they had set up for toasts and speeches. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Robert's 85th birthday," Margaret began, her voice steady and clear. "As many of you know, Robert and I have been married for 60 wonderful years. We've shared so much together, raised 4 beautiful children, built a home, created memories that I will treasure forever." Robert was smiling and nodding, still not realizing what was about to happen. The guests were all listening attentively, expecting a sweet tribute to a long marriage. "But tonight," Margaret continued, "I want to talk about something else Robert has shared, his incredible capacity for love. You see, Robert's heart is so big that he couldn't limit himself to just one family. For the past 25 years, he's been sharing his love with our neighbor Susan and their 2 children, David and Sarah." The room went dead silent. Robert's face turned from white to green, and several people gasped audibly. Margaret gestured toward Susan and her children, who were now clearly wanting to disappear into the floor. "I discovered recently that Robert has been living a double life," Margaret continued, her voice never wavering. "While I thought we were building our retirement together, Robert was actually building a second family right next door. He's been financially supporting them, attending their graduations and weddings, and playing the role of husband and father in a completely separate household." The silence in the room was deafening. Robert tried to interrupt, but Margaret held up her hand to stop him. "Now, I know what you're all thinking. This sounds like something out of a soap opera, but I have documentation of everything: birth certificates, school records, financial transactions, photographs, spanning decades. Robert didn't just have an affair, he created an entirely parallel existence. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of photos. She held up the family portrait she had found in Susan's house. This is Robert with his second family. As you can see, David and Sarah are clearly his children. They have his eyes, his smile, even his stubborn chin. Several of Margaret's children had moved closer to get a better look at the photos, their faces showing shock and confusion. Robert's brother was staring at him with disgust. The church friends looked scandalized, while some of the neighbors seemed to be putting pieces together in their own minds. But here's the thing, Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. I'm not telling you this to humiliate Robert, though I admit there's some satisfaction in that. I'm telling you this because I want you all to understand why I'm doing what I'm about to do. Margaret reached into her purse again and pulled out a manila envelope. Robert, these are divorce papers. I'm serving them to you here, in front of everyone, because I want witnesses to this moment. After 60 years of being your faithful, trusting wife, I'm finally standing up for myself. The crowd was completely stunned. Several people had their phones out and were recording everything. Robert looked like he might have a heart attack, while Susan appeared to be in complete panic mode. But that's not all, Margaret continued. I've also filed a lawsuit against you for financial fraud. You see, Robert depleted our retirement savings, took out credit cards in my name, and remortgaged our house, all to support his secret family. He stole from me for decades to fund his double life. Margaret's oldest son stepped forward, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. Mom, is this really true? Dad, how could you do this to our family? Robert finally found his voice, but all he could manage was a weak, Margaret, please, we can talk about this privately. Margaret laughed, a sound that was both bitter and liberating. Privately. Robert, you gave up the right to privacy when you decided to live this lie for 25 years. I've been having private conversations with myself for weeks, trying to understand how the man I loved could deceive me so completely. Now it's time for a public conversation. Margaret turned to address Susan directly. Susan, I don't entirely blame you. Robert is a charming man, and I understand how someone could fall for him. But what I don't understand is how you could look me in the eye for 15 years, borrow sugar from my kitchen, and accept help from my husband, all while carrying on this charade. Susan finally spoke up, her voice shaking. Margaret, we never meant for it to happen this way. We fell in love, and then when the children came, we didn't know how to. How to what? Margaret interrupted. How to tell the truth. How to take responsibility for your choices. You've had decades to figure that out, Susan. Instead, you chose to make me an unwitting participant in your relationship. Margaret turned back to the crowd, many of whom were still in shock. I want you all to know that I don't regret the 60 years I spent with Robert. We raised wonderful children together, and I have many happy memories. But I also want you to know that I refuse to spend whatever years I have left living a lie. She looked directly at Robert, who was now sitting down and appeared to be struggling to breathe. Robert, you made your choice 25 years ago when you decided to start a secret family. You chose to prioritize your own desires over honesty, commitment, and respect for the woman who had given you her entire adult life. Now, I'm making my choice. Margaret's voice softened slightly as she addressed her children. I know this is shocking and painful for all of you. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I needed witnesses to this moment. Your father has been lying to all of us for decades, and I won't be complicit in that lie anymore. The party, obviously, came to an abrupt end. Robert's family left in various states of shock and anger. Several people approached Margaret to offer support, while others seemed too stunned to know what to say. Susan and her children slipped out quietly, but the damage was done. The entire community now knew the truth. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's story spread far beyond their small neighborhood. Someone had recorded portions of her speech and posted it online, where it quickly went viral. The video was shared millions of times, with comments praising Margaret's courage and strength. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing Margaret about her decision to expose her husband's deception so publicly. Margaret became an unexpected spokesperson for older women who had been deceived or taken advantage of in their marriages. She received thousands of letters and emails from women, sharing their own stories of betrayal and asking for advice on how to rebuild their lives after discovering their husband's lies. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. With all the documentation Margaret had gathered, Robert had no choice but to admit to the financial fraud. The court ordered him to pay restitution for all the money he had stolen from their joint accounts, and Margaret was awarded the majority of their remaining assets, including the house. Robert and Susan's relationship didn't survive the public exposure. Susan, humiliated by the scandal and facing judgment from the entire community, moved away within 2 months of the party. Robert, now living alone in a small apartment and facing social ostracism from their former friends, tried multiple times to reconcile with Margaret, but she refused to even speak to him. Margaret's children, after the initial shock wore off, rallied around their mother with incredible support. They helped her redecorate the house, organize her finances, and adjust to her new life as a single woman. Margaret discovered that she actually enjoyed living alone for the first time in her adult life. She could eat what she wanted, watch what she wanted on television, and make decisions without having to consider anyone else's needs. 6 months after the birthday party that changed everything, Margaret was featured on a national talk show discussing her experience. When the host asked her if she regretted the way she handled the situation, Margaret's response became one of the most quoted statements of the year. "I spent 60 years being the woman Robert wanted me to be: quiet, trusting, accommodating. I put his needs first, believed his lies, and allowed myself to be diminished by his deception. That woman deserved better, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left being the woman I should have been all along, strong, independent, and unwilling to accept anything less than honesty and respect." Margaret's story resonated with people around the world because it represented something universal: the power of standing up for yourself, even when it seems too late. At 82 years old, she proved that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity and demand the respect you deserve. The story became legendary not just because of the dramatic way Margaret exposed her husband's lies, but because of what she did afterward. Instead of retreating into bitterness or isolation, Margaret used her experience to help other women in similar situations. She started a support group for women who had discovered late-in-life betrayals, wrote a book about her experience, and became an advocate for financial literacy among older women. 2 years later, Margaret is still living in the house she and Robert once shared, but she's made it entirely her own. She travels frequently, has taken up painting, and has developed friendships with people who value her for who she truly is, not for the role she played in someone else's lie. Robert, meanwhile, has become something of a cautionary tale in their former community. His secret children want nothing to do with him. His legitimate children have limited contact with him, and he lost most of his friends and social connections. The man who thought he could successfully manage 2 families for decades ended up losing both of them. Margaret's story proves that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth, loudly, publicly, and without apology. Her birthday party confrontation didn't just expose her husband's lies, it liberated her from a life built on deception, and gave her the chance to create something authentic and meaningful in her final years. When people ask Margaret if she's happy now, her answer is always the same: "I'm honest now." And that's something I hadn't been able to say for 60 years. Honesty feels a lot like happiness to me. That's the story of how Margaret Thompson's discovery of her husband's secret family led to one of the most legendary acts of personal justice anyone in our community has ever witnessed. It's a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to live a lie anymore.